Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's discussion, Ann Mitchell, SVP of Ipsos's corporate reputation. Ann, you have the floor.
Thanks, James. Thanks so much for the intro and welcome to everyone. Excited to have you all here today. First, I will quickly introduce our speakers today and cover off on what you can expect from today's session. So first up will be Sean Simpson. Sean leads our team of reputation experts in Canada. Next will be his American counterpart, Jason McGrath. And last but certainly not least will be Trent Ross, our Chief Research Officer. So this whole team here specializes in understanding what drives and disturbs trust and reputation in businesses and brands. And in using those insights, we really help business and comms leaders like yourselves strengthen relationships with their key stakeholders, mitigate risk, and maximize impact. So excited to have this discussion with you all today. As James said, please use the chat feature. We're really excited to hear from you. And look forward to your questions at the end. But first up, what can you expect from today's session? So Sean will get us started here momentarily, just kind of talking about the macro forces that shape today's landscape and sets the stage for what we're hearing from the Reputation Council participants, which is the main focus of our discussion today. And then we'll pass off to Jason, who will talk a little bit more about the new principles that communicators are adopting in the current environment, how they're adapting to the current social and political environment, and then touch on what it means to be a CCO in today's world and how their relationships with people across their organizations are evolving and how their mandate is evolving. And then Trent will double click on a really hot topic in ESG, what the future of ESG strategy and communications is, how we're seeing our participants really modify and adapt to the current environment and manage risk proactively. And then we'll close out with really some additional contextual insights on what to expect from here, some interesting sneak peeks at other Ipsos data that we've got available. And hopefully we'll close out with an active discussion with the group here. So with that, I will turn over to Sean to set the stage and talk about the current state of play. Over to you, Sean.
Thanks so much, Anne. I'm delighted to be here with my American colleagues. Of course, we're showing continental unity, North American unity, because as we sit for this webinar, Prime Minister Mark Carney is actually in Washington, D.C. meeting with President Donald Trump. So we're having our own tete-a-tete here while the macroeconomic forces are at play. And we want to set these results in the broader context of what's going on in the world, because, of course, the situation is so dynamic. Last year, we found that global citizens weren't feeling good at all about prospects for their world or even for their country. But as you got closer to home, and especially within one's own family, the prevailing belief was that things were going to be okay. However, given the challenges of the last year, optimism for one's own city or town, or optimism for one's own family even, has dropped by 7 points in just 1 year. The polycrisis is morphing into a permacrisis, and citizens are adjusting their expectations for the future accordingly, and of course the expectations that they have of the companies and brands they support. This is largely being driven by three macro forces. One is economic recalibration. We're seeing that disparities are increasing, that people are increasingly believing that the system is broken, or at least only perpetuates the power and wealth for those who already have it, and people are starting to fight back. Technology's double-edged sword has shown that AI is both great opportunities but also poses significant risk. Innovation has outpaced regulation, and some of the promises of that innovation aren't quite living up to the hype in the day-to-day lives of communicators. And finally, societal reconfiguration. We've got large masses of people who are moving, migrating, whether by necessity or by choice, and the implications on society and business are, of course, massive. So let's just click into each one of these for a moment. The biggest contextual change over the last year, of course, has been a rise in economic instability and increasing geopolitical tensions. These are largely influenced by the Trump administration's efforts to set the global trade agenda. The rest of us are falling in line as we can. This in turn is linked to growing nationalism, protectionism, patriotism, and the desire for control in what's viewed as a zero-sum game of global economics and deficits. What happens on the global stage is keenly felt by our communicators as these tensions tilt the cost of everyday goods and services on top of the post-pandemic inflation shock we were already experiencing, driving politics and consumer behavior choices. With regards to technology, from searching for innovation to assisting us at work, the integration of AI into our daily lives has gone from niche to mainstream. Virtually everybody's using it in some way, shape, or form, but maybe not all the time. Questions persist about the long-term effect of technology on our social and practical skills and the security of our data, important a lot to our banking clients. Many worry about whether there are sufficient ethical and practical controls in place to protect society from bad actors leveraging AI or from models going rogue and slipping from our collective and individual grasp. Communicators are using AI quite differently than they were even just a year ago, and we'll delve into that in greater detail as well. And finally, on societal reconfiguration, the past year has been one of rolling back diversity and sustainability initiatives. I'm sure many of you on this call are feeling it. Many organizations are trying to seek, or rather protecting themselves from public backlash, despite calls for more inclusivity and more tolerance. The growing mobility and diversity of citizens is sharpening divisions on identity, part of a deepening divide on social issues from immigration to gender. While the U.S. is perhaps the most polarized in this regard, we see increasing fragmentation in many nations around the world. Canada, too, has rolled back its immigration targets and greatly reduced the number of international students allowed to study in Canada. It certainly is a global trend. And so when we look back at our global trends data, which began in 2013, we've seen increasing willingness among customers to spend more for a brand with an image that appeals to them and whose values align with their own. Both Canada and the USA are up double digits in that decade. This demonstrates the needs for brands to align with their consumers' values, with their consumers' identity, and that requires a deep understanding of what those values and signifiers are and how they're shifting in the present context. As people look to form and control their identities, the brands they buy become a part of that. The trends around brands, personal values, and identity are some of the biggest changes that we've seen in our global trends data since 2013. And this underscores our central focus here in the corporate reputation practice, which is to understand the evolving nature of reputation, what drives it, so that our partners can better respond to those expectations. And so we'll dig into the results of our reputation councils in this context that we present those results. And these results help us understand how chief communications officers, heads of corporate affairs, public affairs, and other senior communications professionals around the world are navigating these challenges that we're all facing. We spoke with 161 senior communicators across 19 markets. Both Canada and the US are well represented within these global findings, so let's dig in. In this era of perma-crisis, polycrisis, we're seeing the mandate of the chief communications officer expand dramatically. Geopolitics has emerged as a paramount concern, transforming the CCO, the Chief Communications Officer, into a geopolitical analyst, vital in turning global chaos into strategic opportunities for their organizations. Political and cultural headwinds mean that it's getting even harder to walk that ESG tightrope. Yes, ESG remains important, you've told us so, but maybe a little less so than in previous years. And the term itself isn't really working. We may see the acronym fade from use. As such, the discipline is entering a pragmatic era. Our council members signaled a strategic withdrawal from high-profile proclamations and authentic endeavors that bind ESG into the DNA of business strategy. We're seeing a deliberate move away from acronyms, away from jargon, and towards clear, authentic narratives that speak to genuine efforts in climate resilience, equality, and operational integrity. In fact, many of those climate commitments that we maybe made in haste over the last couple of years are being rewritten, and consumers seem to be okay with that so long as they're replaced by a fresh, authentic commitment in other areas. Sticking to acronyms, we can't get away from here. While AI adoption is widespread, council members' confidence in its ethical implementation it requires reinforcement and bolstering. Yet, as communicators grow more adept with AI's nuances, the transition from hype to strategic utility becomes essential. Strategic silence is now a potent tool. Our research revealed a shift from activism to resilience. It's about building an organization that's so robust, it needs no defense. The more introspective approach that we're seeing, focusing on the symbiosis between internal coherence and public reputation, strengthens brand positions in a polarized world. Our findings underscore the evolution of the CCO-CEO relationship, that relationship between the Chief Communications Officer and the CEO in response to all of this. You know, the CEO can't be an expert of everything, and we're finding that they're increasingly relying on that communications professional as a trusted advisor, not just simply a communicator, either internally or externally. Unprecedented access to the CEO emphasizes the CCO's indispensable role in guiding business strategy simply beyond communication. And so we'll look at the state of play. The report overall describes this era of unprecedented volatility as persistent turbulence. It's not going away. The polycrisis we've spoken about shows no signs of abating. Political, social, economic shocks are coming together with alarming frequency, and I'm sure this is making your jobs as communications professionals more challenging. And I know the word unprecedented could start to lose its meaning, but this quote that you see on the screen from one of our council members neatly illustrates the nature of this volatility. It's chaotic, it's rapidly changing, and unlike anything that we've seen before, truly unprecedented. And in this chaos, the CCO's role has indeed been transformed. They become a strategic sense maker, tasked with interpreting this chaotic external environment for their board, for their senior leadership team, and helping them navigate a path through it. Staying away from the third rail, essentially. Hence the title for this year's report, which is The Eye of the Storm. We're all in it. And we asked council members about their top 3 challenges, and it's perhaps no surprise to you, because you were the folks that we were speaking to, that geopolitics came first and foremost, and for some members, second and third as well. The lines between international relations and corporate strategy have been blurred. You know, politics is business, business is politics, and consumers are now getting wrapped up in all of it as well. From how council members describe their roles and responsibilities, they're essentially having to act as a geopolitical analyst. I know I'm using my political science degree more than I ever have in the last 18 years. Separating signal from noise on tariffs. You know, what's a crisis, what isn't? Assessing how actions in one market will be perceived in another. You know, we're increasingly global from a communication standpoint, but starting to reverse some of those globalization trends and falling back into our own societies a little bit. Working out what to say or do about culture wars like ESG or DE&I. When should you speak and when should you stay silent? While at the same time managing the role, the risks, the rewards of AI and the potential opportunities and threats that it presents to your organization. And with that, I'll pass it off to Jason to lead us through the CCO's newest tool in the toolbox, staying silent.
Awesome. Thanks, John. You know, if we think just about a few years ago, in the wake of George Floyd's murder, or Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there was, as one council member calls it, a unanimous agreement, an outpouring of opinion from companies who felt clear about what they should say. But given the increasing unrest in recent years, corporate activism has certainly changed. One of the key themes that emerged from our research was this new approach being adopted by communicators, strategic silence. And we heard from Sean about some of the key macro forces that we as communications and corporate affairs leaders are navigating: economic recalibration, high-speed innovation and technological advancement, and societal reconfiguration. And it's against this backdrop that the communications playbook has really been torn up. Consensus has been fractured. But one area of consensus is the importance of risk monitoring. We see here on this slide a vast majority of council members reporting that their organizations have formalized plans to monitor and quantify geopolitical risk. It's no longer enough for communicators to simply monitor for known issues or measure reputational risk on an annual basis, because we're simply facing such a robust and dynamic set of threats today. And therefore, risk monitoring and planning has become an even more crucial exercise. And that includes things like monitoring and reporting on key topics, scenario planning and analysis, and ensuring that crisis management frameworks are thoroughly developed and that external support is available and coordinated when needed. And given the complexities of shifting societal trends and geopolitical risks, communications leaders find themselves today in a really precarious position as they attempt to thread the needle of a multi-stakeholder world. A new set of guiding principles has emerged. The first is, as Sean mentioned, strategic silence, right? And this is a deliberate risk-assessed decision to remain silent on issues that are just simply not core to the business. It's become increasingly difficult for organizations to determine, should we take a stance on an issue or not? To evaluate then, how do we communicate about our stance on an issue in an authentic and relevant way without alienating a large portion of the population, whether that be our consumers, policymakers, investors, or even our own employees. And in that context, what we see on this slide is that only 1 in 5 council members today prefer to speak out on potentially divisive issues. Nearly half say it really depends on the situation, on whether we want to take a stand, whether we don't want to take a stand. And the highest number we've seen in this type of polling, 32% of senior communicators and corporate affairs leaders simply say we prefer that our company stays quiet. So this is where we find a fairly consistent theme here in our discussions, is that there's simply far less reputational advantage to taking a stance today than there ever has. The days of trying to gain an upper hand on competitors by having a quick viewpoint on a contentious issue are gone. So in the words of one of this year's participants, I just don't see any advantage to your reputation by taking a strong stance right now. And in fact, another member said 2 years ago, the world was quite different in this respect. But right now, every company is trying to keep their brand and their organization out of the news on these issues. They aren't thinking of taking a leap on competitors or others by coming out with a stance. So more companies today are choosing to keep their heads down and just simply stay out of the spotlight. And that takes me to our second guiding principle, which is fortifying the home front. In our interviews this year, what we found is that as external communications becomes more fraught with risk, the focus is pivoted inward. And we need to build and embed a robust culture amongst our workforce. So while companies may be muting some of their external pronouncements, many are continuing to invest in and support their employees through robust diversity and inclusion initiatives, through sustainability initiatives. But even with these, companies need to temper the language they're using and navigate differences in their workforce as well, whether those be political differences, generational differences. It could be differences based on employee roles, such as manufacturing facility employees or field employees versus corporate office employees. And companies are trying to navigate this internal culture and development with care, recognizing that what's internal is often going to be immediately external as well. And that's why our third guiding principle is so crucial. And that's about anchoring in authenticity. So in an environment where saying less is often the safer option, the moment when a company does choose to speak, they carry immense weight today. So council members tell us that when engagement is necessary, it has to be inextricably linked to the company's core purpose, their values, and their business operations, really the North Star of the organization. And now more than ever, the image that's communicated externally has to also reflect the internal reality. So the only way that we can guarantee that we're not going to be canceled is if our actions are simply unimpeachable. So we consider the complex environment that communications and corporate affairs leaders find themselves navigating. And it's no surprise then that the modern CCO is viewed as a trusted advisor to the CEO, a strategic powerhouse. We're simply expected to do more today, not only to be the voice of the organization, but to help build and defend that company's reputation, to help guide the company through a wide variety of issues today, to manage stakeholder expectations, to monitor geopolitical risk, just a few challenges we're facing. And within this environment, it's no surprise then that 2/3 of Reputation Council participants say their job responsibilities have become more difficult to manage over time. So with the role expanding to cover so many different priorities, many of our Rep Council participants mention that staffing and budgets have not necessarily kept pace with the increasing demands, and that further compounds the challenges that they face. Interestingly, with those additional expectations on Reputation Council participants and their teams, we find that only half are currently content with their work-life balance. Many of our participants actually indicate that, look, this is what they signed up for, right? We chose this career path. We took the opportunities to lead some of the world's largest companies at this executive level. But for others, the stresses of this position are certainly real. And we hear that in our interviews. We see that in the urgency of some of the reputation work that we're doing today in trying to keep up with what the latest potential crisis is or understanding what the implications of perhaps a political position may be. And we look at this against the backdrop of the promise of AI. In the efficiencies that there was hope and optimism around how we will all be more efficient in how we manage communications, how we communicate internally and externally. And so we explored this again this year, and specifically the implementation of AI within the communications and corporate affairs functions. And what you see here is that there is still a very high level of anticipation that AI is going to fundamentally change and transform business operations. But what about the application today, specifically within the comms function? What's interesting about this is that we asked this question in 2023, and now 2 years later, we asked this again. Fewer Reputation Council participants today indicate that they're using AI meaningfully in their day-to-day job as compared to 2 years ago. You can see here is only 43% of our participants say that they agree they're using it meaningfully versus 58% in 2023. It seems many have jumped in 2023, saw a lot of potential, but have actually backed away from it in certain regards. And that really begs the question on whether AI is delivering as expected, whether further application and testing of AI in the comms function is necessary, whether there are other barriers to AI driving meaningful value and efficiency for the comms function, and in what ways it can be used to help build in efficiency and manage this increased workload. Perhaps what we find is that one of the key barriers to more meaningful AI adoption is what Sean mentioned at the beginning regarding ethical policies. And we did ask that of our business leaders, our comms leaders in this wave of the research, about whether ethical policies today in place to govern AI are sufficient. And today, only 11% of our comms and corporate affairs leaders believe that these existing ethical policies are sufficient for the widespread adoption of AI. And that's not to say comms teams aren't using it. They certainly are. We've heard from many Rep Council participants mentioning they use it for early drafts of materials. They're repurposing content for different channels by feeding it into AI and exporting new methods of launching that content, giving it greater reach, and many other use cases. But many indicate they are still just dabbling with it, still in early exploratory stages, and they've not yet fully integrated it into the function. So there's still opportunity here for sure. But we have to overcome this barrier of existing ethical policies. And I think that this quote is representative of ultimately what we heard this year, which is that teams are certainly using AI, but it's not a replacement tool. It helps us to be more agile. It requires human oversight and involvement, though. And I believe that this is particularly true in an environment where words matter more than ever. So remaining true to your values, communicating authentically, it's more critical than ever. So I'll hand it off to Trent now to talk about the evolution of ESG. We'd love to discuss this more with you at the end. Trent?
Great, thanks, Jason. So as you can imagine, the polarization that Sean talked about and the strategy of silence that Jason talked about, those all come to a head when it comes to a company's role in ESG. If you were participating in our webinar earlier this year where we were talking about the ESG Council that we also conduct, we saw the early signs of hesitance and worry there among the CSOs. And now that we've done our interviews with CCOs half a year later, boy, is it really boiled to a head. But it's not just these corporate players who are seeing the push, right? So this is some research from work that we do for the EDF. Generally, people want the environment to take precedence over economic development, but they don't think that's actually going to happen. Generally, they think that economic growth and jobs take priority over any potential negative environmental impacts. And so there's already a lot of push and pull in society. But when you go and you ask the CCOs, if we look at the next slide here, almost everybody we talk to in the US, 96% of the CCOs we talk to, expect that the corporate sector is going to roll back their ESG commitments. Now, it's only 75% globally, which is still almost everybody. But yeah, it's really tough out there. And if you think about, this is, again, tentative strategy of silence when it comes to ESG communications over the next 12 months. This was a little bit lower when we talked to our ESG Council participants, but there sure is a lot of pushback in the world right now that communications professionals are feeling. The other side of this, though, as Sean mentioned, is that companies need to take care of their employees. And look at that, 81% say that ESG initiatives provide a competitive advantage in attracting and retaining talent. So it's this inside versus outside communications plan that Jason was speaking to. If you can talk about your initiatives, especially those that are inward facing, but maybe keep that inside rather than talking about it externally, especially when it comes to very polarized areas like social cohesion. So if we look at the next slide here, you can see that in our global trends research, there's a lot of pushback on what you would think of as social identity, right? And while this polarization, a lot of people speak of it as something new, you also have to remember that V.O. Key back in the 1950s, in writing about Southern politics in the US, had what he called the proximity polarization hypothesis, which essentially boils down to that the more the status quo is challenged, and the stronger that challenge is, the stronger the pushback will be. And now we're starting to see that pushback around the world when it comes to things like gender roles and equality. But I really want to emphasize here that while these results show a lot of pushback, there are also a lot of results on the next slide where we have strong majorities supporting sustainability. People really do think that we're headed for environmental disaster and that businesses have a duty to contribute to society. Now, it just means that the way companies talk about things and what they talk about needs to be married to what they do. And we'll come back to this idea of authenticity that Jason mentioned earlier in his set. I would also add that while several of these points are about the environment, we also know that if you expand social to include things like jobs and the economy, then people have a lot of support for what companies can do to help society. The other, if we go back to Reputation Council findings, most agree that a company's plans on ESG has significant influence on strategy. And nearly all of the people on the ESG Council agree with that. This is a little bit different than what we saw in earlier years of the Reputation Council, where it was, we're working on sustainability, but it's not at the board. It's been absorbed into corporate cultures, and my belief is that companies are getting to continue to do these things. Is what they talk about that is where the real difference lies. And increasingly, what they talk about may not use the term ESG, right? So ESG, like DEI, has become polarized. Sustainability never worked as a term, frankly, because people almost all the time use that to refer to environmental impacts rather than making your business run more efficiently. And so only a third of council members think ESG is capturing what they do. I have a strong sense that we're going to start talking about these items using the old terms of corporate social responsibility, or CSR again. I think that's a much better capture of what companies do in this area and entails much less risk. I would also, though, challenge that we need to talk about efficiency. But there's one piece that we want to spend a little extra time on today with another little piece of research on what does it mean to be an American company in a global marketplace. And as Sean and Jason both mentioned, a lot of the polarization and pushback is being led from the U.S. And is perceived as a U.S. push, especially some of the polarization we're seeing. And so what impact does that have on American companies and brands? Well, if we look at the data on the next slide there, we have a couple of things that we've released. There's the impact of being seen as an American brand in the international markets. But we also have a monthly series of webinar on Know the New America, which is the intersection of politics and corporate and business culture. So in our research, we find that if you are perceived as an American rather than as an international company, there's a negative impact on trust and on purchase intent. And this expands across all of the non-US markets that we included in the research. If you are perceived to be international, you do much better than being perceived as American. And the American penalty is about 20 points, both on trust and on purchase intent. Only in the US is being perceived as America a net positive. So if we look at the next slide here, just to give an example of how we would calculate this, on the left, you ask if a company or brand is an international brand, an American brand, or a local brand. We asked this in 10 countries for this little piece of research. And then the net America effect is the net trust of being perceived as international minus American, and the same for purchase intent. And so if we look at the next slide, we can see how this rolls up across markets. It's a net negative 20 points in almost every market, including our friends Sean and the rest of the Canadians. A 20-point impact on purchase intent and a 20-point impact on trust if you're perceived as American rather than international. The biggest purchased impact penalty is actually in the UK. And as you can see in the US, it's actually a net positive, a +6 and a +9 to be perceived as American. So all these commercials that you're seeing in the US now, where companies are really, some companies are really leaning into the Made in America thing, they are likely moving trust and purchase intent in the US. But you also have to remember that your media doesn't stay inside national borders just because that's where you're doing the advertising. Media is international, and so companies need to be very careful about how they position themselves in this regard, especially as political cycles last 4 years, companies last a lot longer than that. So if we go back around to what we do about this, right? Jason mentioned this earlier. It's authenticity. We often talk about pace when we talk about what companies do in the area of sustainability, or we're going to be changing that word back to corporate responsibility activities. You have to do things that people care about. They have to be pertinent, but you also have to be authentic to who you are. And just the fact that 96% of CCOs in the US say that companies are going to be punting on their sustainability initiatives just goes to show that what they were doing was not authentic to their business, right? If your sustainability activities are not also making your business more efficient, that just leaves you open to these criticisms of greenwashing on one hand and being woke on the other. And so the more that you can concentrate on the business and then how you improve your business to have impacts on the environment or society or on your governance, the more credible and effective those programs will be. And so we've reached the end of our slides here. So I'm going to hand it over to Anne to moderate our Q&A.
Perfect. Yes, and I see a couple of questions in the chat, so I'll get started there in a moment. If you've got a question burning that you haven't typed up yet, take a moment to do that. And what we're landing on here, so as Trent said, we've come to the end of our content plan for today, but a lot of what you see or saw in this presentation is really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of our ability to address these topics, both in terms of Ipsos proprietary research that's available, brand data that's available in some circumstances, and of course our team's real world expertise counseling brands and businesses on these types of issues. So to plant a couple seeds, if there are things that you want to double click on that caught your eye in this presentation, things we can talk more about are diving into what it means to be perceived as an American brand today, how to manage the associated risks and opportunities. Looking at the attendee list here today, I know most of you are managing multinational brands and companies. So how do you manage that balance and communicate to different audiences across your broad spread? That's something we can help with. Also understanding really the intricacies and ins and outs of the current political and legislative landscape is something our team has a lot of expertise in. Also understanding what to do next and how to adapt your ESG strategy, both the strategy itself and how to really resonate with what stakeholders across your organization inside and out expect of you, and how you communicate those in a way that manages risk proactively and builds trust and reputation for your business is something we can assist with. And then the hot and ever evolving topic of AI. We are certainly thinking, as I'm sure all of you are on the phone all the time, about how we can use AI as an enablement tool, whether that's enhancing or in some cases replacing what you're doing to manage reputation and risk right now. How to integrate that into both your comms and research toolkit is something we're happy to talk more about. But obviously the key topic today has been the Reputation Council. So I would be remiss not to say, if you're interested in participating or having someone in your organization participate in Rep Council, we would love to hear from you. And that is actually a question that I saw in the chat. So I'll ask that one first and point this one Jason's way. But Jason, if someone asks, if someone in my team or if I personally would like to take part in Rep Council next year, how do I go about doing that? What are the criteria?
Absolutely, great question. So our Reputation Council, as you saw this year, was our largest one, 161 senior communications and corporate affairs leaders from companies across 19 markets this year. We are always looking for broader representation in this study. The more participants we have in it, the more robust the findings are. The only criteria are simply that we are looking for corporate communications and corporate affairs leaders. So senior leaders in the organization in those functions. By all means, reach out to us if you're interested. We typically start our recruitment and interviewing process in Q1, with a report often published towards the end of Q3. So we'll be getting started probably early next year, and would love to include participants from the organizations represented here today.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason. And I'm seeing a question on ESG too, which I'll point Trent's way. Trent, do we have more data or tools that dive deeper into what the role of business should be on ESG issues, and also how consumer expectations are evolving?
Sure. Yeah, we wrote our first paper on the intersection of companies and ESG back in 2010, right when the UN SDGs were released. And so we've been doing a lot of thinking about this over the years. Our most recent release really focuses on the P in that PACE model in terms of pertinence, looking at what consumers and citizens around the world want from companies when it comes to ESG, and how that differs by industry. And we also have within that data set ratings for companies. So if you want to take a look at that in the future. Let us know if you'd like to see more information. We covered CPG, food and beverage, tech, airlines, resources, and finance on that study. And then a lot of the work that we do for clients, of course, focuses on the rest of that, on what is authentic to you as a business. And if you want to say something that you can't really say yourself, who are your credible partners out there? And then how do we evaluate this effectiveness over time? And effectiveness over time can be viewed through the lens of your reach and your impact on stakeholders of awareness of your activities, but also from the point of view of are your activities actually making a difference in society? And I should further point out that, we have both survey research tools for evaluating the PACE framework, as well as digital tools. Sometimes the digital tools can give us a better read of what's actually in the marketplace rather than what is recalled in the marketplace. And so the two, survey and digital working together, provide a really good view of what companies are doing, is it making a difference, and what are their risk profiles.
Great, thanks, Trent. One more, I'm saying, what more do we know about the perception, or what more do we know about being perceived as an American brand in Canada and in the US? Do you have any insight as to the role sector or specific business dynamics play? So Sean, I'll point this one your way to keep it fair.
Thanks, Anne. So, I mean, clearly in Canada, there's a massive Buy Canada movement right now where Canadians, many of them aren't traveling to the United States, where many would go on summer vacation, for example. Many are prioritizing local or Canadian products over American products. But there's two caveats to that. It's much more prevalent among boomers than everybody else. Over the last year, baby boomers have been fixated on Donald Trump and what they perceive as sort of an affront to Canada, and they are reacting with their wallets, essentially. Younger people, it's not as big an issue for them. And younger people can't afford to buy Canadian. In many respects, it's more expensive because Canadian companies don't operate at the same scale that global or American companies do. So their wallets can't afford to support Canada in that way. The other thing is that we know from a syndicated study we've been tracking called Trump Tariffs and Turmoil, that being an American company in and of itself isn't as large a detriment as you might think, so long as you can demonstrate some Canadian credentials. And what I mean by that is jobs in Canada, supply chain, in Canada, products manufactured in Canada. So there are other ways to promote Canadianness, even for those companies that aren't Canadian. And as we move along in our journey, our relationship with the United States this year, which has been a little bit rocky, there is more of a nuanced understanding of what it means to be Canadian or American than there was, earlier this year. So it's about results in Canada, contributing to economic growth, societal challenges that Trent was talking about, and that can help overcome sort of the politics of being an American brand in Canada right now.
Great, thanks, Sean. And I know there's an extended version of some of the insights that we were previewing in today's presentation, so we'll make sure we have that available. And we also have some brand and company specific data as part of that study that we've not publicly released, so happy to address any questions around that and offer either sector insights, or if we have your brand's data available, I know the team would be happy to walk you through that. That concludes the questions I'm seeing in the chat for now. As always, feel free to continue to reach out to our team. We'll be sending through a recording of today's presentation for those who weren't able to join us live, or if you'd like to rewind the tape and go back to any of these sections or the discussion here today. But thank you again to everyone who's attended. We look forward to staying in touch with you. And with that, wishing you all a happy afternoon.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.